Hello, everybody. It's Dr. Newmark here. This is the week 13 highlights video, and I can't believe we're in week 13 already. But without further ado, we're going to jump right in. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Tufte's visual explanations, chapters 1 and 2, and Cozza's getting the word out. I don't know if you've ever heard of Edward Tufte before, but if you haven't, now's as good a time as any. He's a really important figure. In fact, a foundational figure in the theorization of data visualization. So he's a really important guy. And let's get into his work here. Okay. So in this book, Visual Explanations, I had you read 2 chapters, but I believe I included the PDF of the whole book. So if you're curious I know some of you, it's been clear and you've said in your scrapbook or discussion board posts that you've read the whole book. So that's really like a go-getting approach, and I really love it. But I just only had you read 2 chapters. It's funny though, when I was in grad school, as I've told you, I think in my introduction video, I actually did my PhD in American Literary Studies. And then I worked in the public relations field and in engineering communication after or actually before grad school. And I had a background in sort of professional communication. So my training in rhetoric and writing, along with my American Lit degrees, sort of fused together to make me the person I am today, focusing in technical communication. However, in my critical theory and American literature training, we had to read a book a week. Like, I don't know if that's common anymore. So I'd be really curious as to what you're doing in your other grad classes, whether people are having you read a book a week or several chapters and critical texts like I'm having you do. Anyway, so sorry for that detour, but I just thought I'd ask you that question. All right, so in this chapter, images and quantities, I want to contextualize that by giving you a little bit of information about what Tufte says in the introduction. So he explains that his 3 books have been about pictures of numbers, pictures of nouns, and pictures of verbs. And you have read parts of the 3rd one. So despite their quantifying scale and grids, maps resemble miniature pictorial representations of the physical world. So I started today's presentation with this image of a map. I love map images. I think they do like really interesting work in our lives as a way to sort of visualize something very abstract that we can't see with our own eye. If we look at historical maps and the way that like artists even or geographers, more like theoretical geographers, construct these visual representations of abstract space or even imagined space. A lot of you have perhaps read fantasy fiction books that include in the front cover a map of this fantastical mystical territory. Like the way that we imagine space and render it in two dimensions is really interesting. I actually have my book here on my bookshelf. And in thinking about this and saying that, I didn't plan to show you this, but in thinking about this, it just makes me realize that my book has a map in the, you can't see it because it's blurred, but in the front pages, I have a map. And the map actually was a Parker Brothers puzzle from the 1940s that I found on eBay, and I had to assemble. I think it's from the 1940s. I'll have to look at the image credits again, but I wanted to assemble this map, and it's super interesting, this tactile experience of building a children's puzzle map. And then I had to build it on the bed of a huge flat bed scanner so I could get it at the DPI that I needed for the book. There was a reason, there was this sort of continuing thread through the book of maps and meaning making. Anyway, so here I have this map of Finland here, this old map. And I showed it to my students last year, and it has all these royal crests here. I don't remember the year of this map, but if you looked at it, I included the link for those students. If you look at it zoomed out, the way that it rendered like the actual physical territory of Finland's geography, the space, did not reflect the way that we look at Finland as represented on a map today. If you look at historical maps of the state of New Mexico or of the southwestern United States, obviously because of lots of geopolitical movements over time and colonialism, the way that the territorial dividing lines have been imposed has dramatically differed over time. And this is just another way of manifesting a kind of data in two-dimensional space on a tactile map. A lot of you are really interested in material textuality of books. Maps are just taking that to an additional kind of level. They compress a story down into these two dimensions. So anyway, as Tufte writes, so this book describes design strategies, the proper arrangement in space and time of images, words, and numbers for presenting information about motion, processes, mechanism, cause, and effect. That's what he means by pictures of verbs. So if you look at this map on the screen, and I've only included like a little fragment of it, or other maps, the map that's in the front pages of my book here. I know you can't see it, but I think you might be able to pull this up in Google Books. But anyway, you can see that this does, in fact, tell a story about motion, process, mechanism, and cause and effect. And in fact, as I told you, by putting the pieces in place on this puzzle, I was in fact doing an action and assembling something. Okay, so in this chapter, Images and Quantities, Tufte discusses maps and diagrams relative to their size and in relation to relative size. So how is this pertinent to technical illustrations? I think it's super interesting to see a technical illustration of something that we can't really fathom with our own eye, like a cutaway diagram or a exploded diagram of an airplane or an engine, something that's very hard for us to perceive with our own eye. So has the small size of a component ever caused you surprise or difficulty? And have you ever felt that this size element was not accurately explained or shown in the documentation? As I've told you, I always have like documentation on my desk here. And I always have, for when I teach English 2210 technical writing, I love to show my students that technical communication exists around us everywhere in our lives. And so I'm always cutting out little pieces of technical documentation. And one that I have was on the box, the flaps that closed a box on a humidifier. And it showed how to assemble the humidifier. And it showed all the different little components. But if you've ever built something complicated, whether it's a Lego or you've had to assemble something even more complicated than that, which you probably have, sometimes in the visual elements in the documentation, they'll show sort of a pull-out image of one part of a component. So I'm asking you to think about that small size, that magnification of that size in relation to the larger image. Has that ever, have you ever encountered a problem with the way that was represented? So we have discussed already that the scale and physicality of an artwork can convey a kind of aura. But we can also be surprised by the size of a famous artwork like the Mona Lisa. I thought I had a picture in the slide presentation. I remember showing it. Maybe it's in next week's, but of my daughter when she was 4, seeing the Mona Lisa for the first time. And she has this, I don't know if you remember from like 20 years ago, there was this very famous meme of the gymnast Michaela Maroney, like having like a not impressed look on her face. And so my daughter was making this very similar looking face. She was not impressed by the size of the Mona Lisa, especially because its reputation preceded it in such a profound way that even a 4-year-old was expecting the size to be more substantial. So I don't know if you've ever seen the Mona Lisa, but I've only seen it that one time, and it was actually rather small. So in that context, in that scenario, the aura wasn't necessarily related to the physical size. The aura of the Mona Lisa transgresses the physical parameters of its size for lots of reasons, which we've discussed. So on page 20, Tufte uses this phrase, the dequantification characteristic of art reproduction. So he points to similar decontextualizations in scientific visual communication. So as I just expressed to you, like an airplane engine is a mammoth thing to me. Whenever I look I'm getting on a plane or I'm in a window seat and I'm looking out on the engine. Just the scale of that is like really kind of intimidating and impressive. But when it is reduced to either in a digital space or before, if it was like diagrammed on a piece of paper, that would be sort of like perhaps a kind of dequantification. There's like a mismatch between its physical size and its representational size. Okay, so because so many scientific graphics lack labels and scales, and this is jumping into a different part of Tufte, Tufte wants to restore quantitative order. He's really, really passionate about pulling us back from the temptation to make things, for lack of a very sophisticated word, like very jazzy visually, at the expense of their scientific validity or their data truth. So Tufte is concerned about scientific images becoming dequantified. When this happens, quote, the language of analysis may drift toward credulous descriptions of form, pattern, and configuration, rather than answers to the questions, how many, how often, where, how much, at what rate? I mean, in scientific data, those are the most important points of information. So Tufte's examples are less obviously scientific in nature, but does this one offer answers to the questions he is concerned about? So this is a scientific graphic, seasonal precipitation, northern Finland seasonal data. You show it here. We're not really going to analyze this very much, but if we were, we would ask of it and we would scrutinize it with care and we would say, do we know how many, how often, where, how much, and at what rate? Is all of that answered in this graphic? Okay. So this image here on the left comes from the article, Citizen Science Discovers a New Form of Northern Lights. And you can ask of this graphic the same questions that were on the previous slide. This is interesting because it's like an overlay of a statistical graphic that's supposed to tell something overlaid on top of a picture that's more of a decorative element than an element that conveys information. So on the right is this famous image of the white aurora. I don't know if you've ever seen these before, but so this white aurora has been debunked as a hoax, but it doesn't stop it from being recirculated year after year. No, this is not a scientific image, but it does resonate with these two questions of Tufte's. How are we to assess the integrity of visual information, of visual evidence? What ethical standards are to be observed in the production of such images? Okay, so this is a very famous map here on the screen, this Jon Snow map. And this used to be funnier to show when Game of Thrones was on television and there was a character named Jon Snow, but this is a different Jon Snow. So in this chapter, Visual and Statistical Thinking, Tufte examines two cases where lives were saved or lost as a direct consequence of the quality of methods used in displaying and assessing quantitative evidence. So here's the first one, the cholera map. I don't know if you've ever heard about this before, but Tufte writes, the credibility of the cholera map grows out of supplemental details in the text, as image, word, and number combine to present the evidence to make the argument. This particular problem, as you read about in the chapter, the spread of cholera, was directly intervened into as a result of this visualization of data on this map. It only became clear what the problem was once it was rendered in this way. So importantly, size matters for visualizations. He writes, if reduced in size, the cholera symbols become murky and the type too small. So think about, how large does a visualization need to be? And we're just so used to being able to zoom in and zoom out with our fingers. I don't know if you've ever received something like materially on paper, and our default now is to zoom in and zoom out, that there's something in your brain that triggers that action in your hand. And you're like, oh, I can't do that. This is two-dimensional. But I don't know how well you understand this point that he's making about the relationship between the symbol and the sort of the scientific practice of solving this problem. Okay, Tufte raises many concerns about overly simplified visual displays of data that flatten out or erase important nuance. And he certainly explores the absence in Snow's own map. I mean, he isn't entirely celebratory of it without finding opportunities to criticize it at the same time. So he honors that map's power and its effectiveness. So it is infographics like the one below that he particularly seems to detest. So he writes, These conjectural weekly aggregations are condensed as news reports. And he means they're all of the like catchy, glossy infographics and data visualizations we see in the media today. They are super abundant, even more than when he wrote this book. So missing are only the decorative cliches of infographics. The language is as ghastly as the charts. He's talking about another example here. At right is how pop journalism might depict Snow's work, complete with celebrity factoids, overcompressed data, and the isotype styling of those little coffins. So this is just sort of a spoof or a mock-up of what something might look like, a contemporary rendering of Snow's map to make it more aligned with the sort of pop journalism that he's talking about. And you know this, all of you experience this on a daily basis, this kind of pop journalistic data visualization. Okay, so regarding the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster of 1986, Tufte assesses that students in many fields are taught about it, and it is used as a cautionary tale. Students studying business, engineering, statistics, and sociology all receive slightly different lessons about the reasons for this catastrophe. Tufte concludes that all of these assessments result in over-determining the accident in different ways. They're over-determining it in the ways that align with their disciplinary interests. He turns then to the weakness, and so we'll look at it as it relates to our interest area, which is the representation of statistical data, either visually, textually, or in a hybridization of the two. So he turns in his analysis to the weaknesses in the charts that Thiokol engineers shared the night before the disaster. So, and I can't read this because my little image here is on top. Okay, there we go. So like magicians, chart makers reveal what they choose to reveal. That selection of data, whether partisan, hurried, haphazard, uninformed, thoughtful, wise, can make all the difference, determining the scope of the evidence and thereby setting the analytical agenda that leads to a particular decision. This is super important, that there is this relationship between sort of the rhetoricity of the science as carried forth through its representation in a table, in a chart, in a graphic. So the rhetoricity is its persuasive capacity, and is that flattened out, reduced, or completely absented the night before the Challenger disaster in these handwritten charts that were created by the Thiokol engineers. So he says the charts were unconvincing, the arguments against the launch failed, and the Challenger blew up. He's not only attributing it to this failure in emphasizing important information in this table, but he's saying that that played a really important role. Okay, Tufte focuses on this graphic from the post-accident Rogers Commission. He discusses the many mystifications of this graphic, and he refers to the cute little rockets here as chart junk. So some important terms from Tufte are these terms chart junk and data ink and lie factor. So we're not really going to go into that, but I do want you, if you have a moment, to look up what those mean. People get so interested in the visual flair of the communication of statistical data that they lose sight of the fact whether it communicates the important data or not. So when I teach my class writing for publication in the biomedical sciences in the biology department, I really dwell upon this concept with those students. Okay, I'm just going to gloss over this part. This is a really interesting article, Cozza, getting the word out. Those of you who teach in our FYC program might want to use some of her strategies in teaching your own classes, because she talks a lot about using political graffiti in an advanced rhetoric class. I presented 2 examples to my Finnish students of Finnish street art. Here they are. This one has an anarchy symbol, and it's using this like heavily Banksied version of this young boy carrying these 2 buckets. If you know who Banksy is, he's a very famous street artist. And then we have this other one on the right that also has this kind of Banksy element to it. But as I write here, Cozza's incorporation of street art into an advanced rhetoric class allowed students to gain insight into what kinds of arguments street artists make and in what historical, social, and political contexts they make them. More importantly, it gave students the chance to expand their attitude toward art and its place in the world. This is the argument about incorporating this kind of visual meaning making into a rhetoric class. You could do it in a FYC class, you can do it in an advanced rhetoric class, as she's showing. I want you to build the bridges yourself between what Tufte is saying in his argument about statistical data and what she's saying in her article about persuasive and political messaging via street art. So there is a difference, which we're not really going to go into in this presentation. Oops. And I guess, let's see, I guess my slideshow ended without me showing you the last slide, but it was of some big, large format graffiti in Albuquerque. There is a difference between sort of like tagging and graffiti and street art, I would say. I would love for you to think about that a little bit more with regard to some of the heavy topics that Tufte raises and that Cozza raises in the article that you read today from the Journal Enculturation, which is an online journal that has some really interesting content as well. Okay, so on that note, I'm going to end this video for today, and I hope you enjoyed this week's readings and that they stay with you for a long time and shape your thinking. All right, have a great rest of your day.